Thank you. Hey, guys. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to talk about shipping great software by writing product specs. And before I do that, I'm just curious to know how many folks in the room are product managers? All right, great. And how many people work in the engineering org? So that would be developers, designers, PMs, ops. All right, great, most of you. Another question, how many of you write what you would call product specs today? Some, not all. And then how many follow Agile, create stories, use some sort of Scrum 2-week sprint process? Most people. OK, great. Oh, one more question. Size of the companies that you work in. So how many people work in companies with 50 or more people in the whole company? OK, excellent. Great. Well, I'm here to talk about shipping software, writing product specs. And I think this talk is really catered to product managers. I think they will find this to be the most valuable. However, anybody who's doing scoping in the organization, whether you're on the business or marketing side, should find some value out of this. In general, I think this sort of process starts to make more sense as your organizations grow. I wouldn't advocate some of this if you're a very small startup. You probably don't need this level of communication and process. But as you grow, you'll find that it's absolutely necessary. Some quick intros. I think this was covered in the nice intro. Thank you. But I think the point that I'm trying to make with describing my background is I've worked in really early stage companies with very few people in them. And then when I joined SurveyMonkey, it was 50 people, grew to 700 people. And I saw all the pains of a fast growth company and how processes break down. And so over time, I found having some specificity in written communication can really help. So why am I here? Well, over the years, in my career, folks have come and told me, hey, we really like sort of how you work with engineering teams. We like this the specificity. We'd like to learn how to do it. People have asked me to coach their teams or to give them some tips. And I thought, let me write a little bit about my process. And so I wrote this blog post last fall, and I found that it started to go viral amongst PMs, engineers. It was on various newsletters. I didn't really have a following on Medium where I published this, and it got a lot of likes. And a few examples of people who started to tweet it out. Joel Spolsky, who founded Stack Overflow and Trello, he was one of my inspirations for writing this. So many years ago when I started my career, I found his post online on writing functional product specs. And he was one of the early program managers at Excel back in the day at Microsoft. So it was really cool for me to see him put this out there. Mike Davidson, he was VP of product at Twitter. And so it was sort of going through this network that I eventually got this email from Chris Chen. And he was like, hey, come in and this could be a valid workshop for people. So my goal with this is to really give you guys very specific tools and at least have a conversation about process, because I'm sure there will be some folks in the room who might think this is a little too heavyweight, and there may be others who think there's some value. So I think there'll be an interesting discussion there. So what is this talk really about? And I forgot I have a clicker. Cool. So this is the reaction some people will have when they're like, oh, you want me to write product specs? You're going to give me this really long-winded template, and I'm going to go and fill it out in a mechanical way. And people think this is really antiquated. This is one of the programmers programming the ENIAC back in 1946. You know that if that's how complicated it is to program this thing, you don't want your requirements changing at a late stage. And a lot of people are like, hey, we move really fast. I actually found a picture of a ninja rock star shredding code. The internet is an amazing thing. And didn't we move on to Agile? Do we really need to be this verbose? And I think it's a bit of the pendulum swinging from one end to the other. It went from people speccing out projects that took 6 months, 12 months, to saying, hey, that's too much specification, and now you've got maybe not enough going on when engineering teams start to execute. So my hope is that at the end of this, you'll find whether it's whether you call it writing more fleshed out stories in Agile or whether you call it a product spec, but there is value to doing this. And multiple teams that I've worked with over the years, we've shipped code multiple times a day. We value ourselves on meeting business KPIs, not process or documentation. So I really do believe this helps you build software that's higher quality with lower risk. So there's a few people out there who agree with this. Mark Andreessen had written a guide for PMs years ago. This is a blurb out of that, and he generally advocates for this. Bezos famously, in board meetings and pitches for new products, doesn't want PowerPoints. The PR FAQ is a document that's famous at Amazon, where if you're pitching a new business unit or a new idea, you write this document down. They're 4 to 6 page documents, and they do force critical thinking. You can't just sort of fake it as you go through that. This is biased. I asked people who came to the blog how many of them already write specs. And clearly people who are looking for it have some of that. So this is a bit of a biased thing. And asking folks in the room, some of this is already going on. So not everybody is a non-believer. So I thought a good way to talk through this would be to actually work through a very specific example. And this is the same example that I actually have on my post. And at some point, I'll actually hand out some handouts and we'll look at what a product spec might look like. So without further ado, suppose you work at a hotel booking site, like an Airbnb or something like that. And you discover that conversion on your checkout page isn't very good and has been dropping. So this is the page that users get to after they've browsed, they've found a reservation. They get to this page, and for whatever reason, they're not converting at a rate that seems to match the industry standard. And there's lots of things your team wants to try. One of them is, let's just put live chat on the page. Let's see what happens. That shouldn't be too hard. So maybe your ticket or your roadmap looks something like this. Try adding it. Conversion is only 18%. The industry standard is 30%. I've made up these numbers. But and we've got some agreement from customer ops to lend us headcount to give this a try. So you're like, okay, well, this isn't a big deal. Let's just go do this thing. So during your sprint planning, you're like, hey guys, I'll take the ticket. I'll figure out a chat vendor, and then I'll forward it on to the dev. You go and do some research. You pick a reasonable vendor like SnapEngage. You're like, this is easy, pretty straightforward. You add the JavaScript blurb. You create an account. You add the little blurb that the developer needs to add to the appropriate page. And you hand the ticket back to them. And then maybe you set up a meeting with support. And voila, you're done. Why do we need product specs at all? This was pretty straightforward. Well, if you're a small company, you probably don't. That would be the appropriate way to go about it. But larger orgs, you're going to find all sorts of things start to happen. This could happen at any size org. But this is, you go to staging, the ticket gets updated, and you're like, yeah, let me give this a spin. And then you discover, oh, the experience on mobile is really crappy. And we know about 30% of our visitors on the checkout page are on mobile. OK, reassign, fix that. Let's do that again. Or maybe you get a call from the customer support manager who's like, what is this test you're doing? Why are you borrowing these folks? I have SLAs to meet. And hey, if we're going to do chat on checkout, we need it in these other places. This vendor, the vendor you've selected doesn't do these 5 different things that I really need it to do. Suddenly, you're calling an emergency meeting with this person to say, hey, these are all completely valid concerns from their point of view, but this is a test. Let's figure out how to make this work. I've seen this happen in production too. An hour after launch, suddenly someone from support is reaching out to the dev team saying, hey, we're getting questions in Spanish, and our support center in Ireland that takes international requests, they're not part of this test, and we don't know what to do. Has anyone seen these kinds of things happen when projects go live? I'm seeing some nods. This is another one that I see, which is we'll file a ticket, I'll go off, be working on other projects, people will be, and I'll come back and be like, what's the status of this project? And I'll take a peek, and somebody's spending a lot of time perfecting some small part of what is really a test. And that would be my fault in not communicating. We don't even know if this is going to work. There's no reason for this to work perfectly on our site and look ideal. We need to get a baseline to know if it's worth even investing in this. And then I don't know how many times you guys have seen something like this happen, which is you run a test or you roll something out, and you're like, yeah, I can't wait to see the results. It's been 2 weeks. Yeah, we've been logging it. Oh, but we're logging the session ID, not the user ID, so we can't, and whatever it is, you quickly realize, wow, that was a huge waste of time. We're going to have to restart the whole thing, and we didn't get it. So in my example here, there isn't a huge amount of damage that's been done. There are other bigger projects where these could have substantial impacts on your business or your roadmap. And the truth is, you will miss out on opportunity. You will create churn in your process. So let's look at the alternative. What if you had written a spec? What might that actually look like? So I'll start a little bit by just sort of going back to the basics. Why would you even bother? I think the most important part of this is you want to do your critical thinking up front. We're running a test. What percentage of users need to go into this? How many people actually need to convert for this to be profitable, even if we do it at scale? Oh yeah, international. Let's leave international out right now. Is that an appropriate decision to make? So I think there's a lot of that you can do on your own. Now, in this example, this is a relatively small example. This might be an afternoon of you sitting down, jotting down some notes, and putting this together. But as the failure modes that I described, like just spending a couple of hours doing this can save your whole organization a bunch of headache. And then you're going to have to communicate this to the person who's going to build it, the support team that's going to support it, their management team that has to account for what they're doing. And there's so many, you could communicate this through a series of meetings, or you could write this down, send it out, and in a review, get all of these things done with. I think it's just a more efficient way to communicate. But more than that, I think it creates the sense of accountability in the organization. You'll find that if you do this in writing and you have this culture of being more specific, stakeholders will be less likely to come back at a later stage with unreasonable requests. You'll also find developers will have more confidence in what's coming out of the org to say, yeah, this isn't total BS. They've thought through edge cases. I'm going to dive deep and give you estimates that I believe in. So I think it makes the process smoother. I don't think you always need to write a spec, obviously, and I've mentioned a couple of these cases. If you've got a small organization, if you're or maybe you're part of a big team, but you're independent, this is a new product, and you're working on your own, it really comes down to how many people are you working with. But even in a larger org, there will be times when you're like, look, the ROI is clear. We absolutely know this is going to work. And so let's shoot first and ask questions later. There are appropriate times to do that. Some rules of thumb that I'd like to stick to is how much calendar time is this going to be? Usually, if it's going to be a couple of weeks, it's worth having something in writing, even if it's a one-pager with some bullets. If there's going to be a material impact on other teams, whether that's customer support, or if I'm working with other dev teams and we're building some piece of infrastructure that everybody is going to use, it's surprising. Yes, of course, some sort of technical spec will be written, but you'd be surprised how even when you're building some large key value store for the whole organization to use so that product teams can do X, Y, Z, if you don't really think through the product ramifications and people go build this big piece of engineering, you realize, oh yeah, cache consistency won't work for 3 of the 10 use cases we were hoping for, and that slows down all these projects. So again, it really does help save a lot of headache down the road. So what should it contain? Yeah, there's templates out there, and your mileage may vary with them. I really think of a spec as just, how am I going to communicate this efficiently? It doesn't matter how you do it, but I think there's sort of 5 main things you want to address. What is the actual problem you're trying to solve, and why is it important to solve? So in our case, we're trying to solve conversion. The reasons are obvious and relevant. You need to be really specific on how you know you'll succeed. So how many conversions do we need to go through checkout in order to understand whether we've actually met our goals or not? And we need a variety of, you need lots of details. So how are people getting to this page? Are they on mobile? Are we doing this for international? You need to walk through a very specific solution at some point. And how specific really, I mean, Joel Spolsky in his original post used this term, think of it as code for human brains to execute. So if you look at it that way, then the instruction set is, however sophisticated your audience is. In some cases, you may need to be more specific if you're working with a more junior team. In other cases, not so much. But you need to at least say things like, I want after somebody types in a question, we need to have a 2-minute SLA. Maybe that's not for the development team, but that's for customer ops, so they can plan and staff accordingly. And then you need some sort of dates and milestones. I typically, as a product manager and coming from an engineering background, will try to put a very high level, hey, here's what I would like, with a big sign around it saying this has no meaning until an engineer actually looks at this and gives me their times. And so as the spec evolves, and by the time we get to a review, I want somebody on the engineering team to have provided this. They own that number, and it really should come from them. But you shouldn't hesitate to put some brackets around, hey, it's not really worth doing this if it's going to take us 3 months to do. So what's the process? This example is relatively simple, so the process here may look a little long-winded. But I'll start by generally writing a few bullet points, and this may happen while we're discussing this in some roadmap planning meeting, or it may happen at some point during our sprint planning. I do this in a text editor. I've used Emacs for years, so I'm just literally just writing a few bullets and saying what I want. After that, as we get closer to the point where we're going to be working on this in a couple of weeks, I really need to get on this, I'll set up a couple of one-on-ones with people who I think are relevant. So for this, I may set up time to chat with a customer ops person, the finance person, to just be like, hey, do my assumptions on resourcing and conversion actually make sense here, and can we do this at scale for all our customers when we roll out, because we will need to hire some people, and is there budget to do that if this actually succeeds? And of course, I'll set up time with a developer, so I can be like, hey, the page we're doing this on is over SSL. Does the support vendor I've picked, will that work, or will that cause some problems? There's other security considerations on that page. Are you going to, at the last minute, tell me we got to shut this down? So I typically won't do this in broad meetings. I don't tend to find that those are useful. Smaller, pointed meetings with individual people is relevant, and it also wastes less time because the other people aren't just sitting around. In our industry, we're pretty privileged to have foosball tables and arcade machines and snack bars. Use them to your advantage as a PM. We had an arcade machine at SurveyMonkey, and we had a contest in the office. We would pick a new old school game like Pac-Man every month, and people would try to beat the score. That was a good time to go and pick the brains of engineers as they were trying to beat that high score. It was also a good tactic to distract them so I could get on top of the leaderboard. But yeah, I mean, those are really, if you have small, tight-knit teams, if you have a culture where people have lunch together or do other things, those are great times to talk about a lot of these things. You don't need formal meetings to run this by. Write and edit the spec. Again, the example I'm talking about is pretty simple. This may be something that you do in an afternoon. The largest specs that I might write will take me a couple of days, but those will be for projects where there's 4 to 6 weeks of work. And again, the idea isn't that there's one gigantic task that's a 6-week task that someone will work on. It's to reach a measurable, reasonable milestone with this project. We need to allocate about 6 weeks of work. That needs to be thought through. I'll spend more time on that. Once I'm done, I'll publish the spec, and I'll set up an hour-long review. And in these reviews, the first thing I'll ask is, who hasn't read the spec and honestly hasn't read it? And it's okay if we spend the first 10 minutes of a 60-minute meeting with people just quietly reading. People who've read it, I'm like, feel free to go get a cup of coffee or check your email. But there's really no point in doing this if people aren't reading it. And related to that, if your team, it's important to get feedback from your team on how well this process is working. Ask them. If people are like, dude, this is really cumbersome. I don't know why you're writing all these details down. It seems like a giant waste of time. I already knew what to do. There may be some truth to that, and you should adjust accordingly. But you'll often find that the pendulum today, I think, has swung to the other extreme, where we just don't provide a lot of feedback, and projects that involve lots of moving parts in different parts of the organization end up having gaps. So you'll find a balance over that time. Yep, review the spec. And then, after the review, I'll send out whatever updates are there, and then I will sit down with my engineering counterpart and we'll say, so how are we going to break this down into chunks? What do you think is appropriate? How long do you think these chunks are? What sprints are we going to put them in? And I found that depending on the level and complexity of the project that we're working on, I may be working with the team lead. But engineers, they like to take ownership. So more and more, I will say for the appropriate size project, I will hand it off to a junior or growing engineer who wants to have more autonomy in how they manage their time and how they work with this. So, but really it should turn into, here are some reasonable milestones, here are tickets that we'll work on. And this really needs to come from engineering. They're the ones who are going to build it. They have to own, or the doers. So that could be design, that could be ops, whoever's actually going to execute. That needs to come from them. Any questions so far? Any thoughts? Yes.
Within the review?
The key stakeholders. So in this example, it would be the engineer, the customer support person, and probably a person from finance. Because if this succeeds, we'll be coming back with an ask saying, hey, we need this many heads next quarter to actually staff this and run it. Only people who have a decision to make. And years ago, so my wife, she works at Microsoft. She runs product marketing for HoloLens now, which is a really cool job. But for years, she worked in all parts of the organization, one of them being Office. And Office is this juggernaut that makes tons of money. It's this very mature business. And so they can't take risks. They have lots of process and stuff. And years ago, I used to sort of make fun of how much process they had and how they thought about owners and stakeholders. But as I started working in larger and more mature orgs, I began to see some of the value of what they did. One of the things I learned from her was around how you allocate roles to different kinds of stakeholders. And so the model that I tend to follow for really large projects, but it applies to any scale, is I think there really should be one owner for any project. So that person you can't have more than one owner. That's always a problem. So that person is the person that you go to if you want to know status. What's going on? How's this going? Is it going well? Is it going poorly? You're going to have some number of stakeholders. I think of these people as veto authority. That's their special thing. They will review it and they can say no. And then you'll have some number of reviewers. These are people who can come to the meeting if they want. They are invited. You will forward project status to them. But they are reviewers. They cannot say no. They may complain and yell, but they don't have the authority to say, I don't think this is relevant. Don't do this. And your job as the PM, the reason you want them there is because they add value, and they're going to teach you something, and they're going to maybe push back and say, maybe in this example, I'm trying to think what might be an example of that. Maybe there's a marketing person who's like, hey, look, I really want to know what you guys are doing with checkout because we have this other big product that's going out, and we're marketing it heavily, and I don't want you to screw up the checkout funnel right around here. You're like, look, I totally understand your concerns. Those are valid. I want you in the room because I want to know the ways we could screw this up. But it's important that we fix this because we're bleeding money on our checkout page when we shouldn't be. So one owner, multiple stakeholders, multiple reviewers, and then some number of doers, right? These are the people who are actually executing. The truth is, some people may wear multiple hats. In a small project like this, the engineer is a doer and a stakeholder. He can say, this is crazy, dude. You can't put this really insecure JavaScript on our checkout page. I won't allow it. Okay, fair. I get it. So anyways, that's kind of how I think about who to invite to the meeting, who are the different people in the process. Again, I think of these as frameworks. These aren't you shouldn't be thinking, hey, every tiny little project needs all these people. But as teams grow and you're working with lots of functions, you're going to find that these are valuable. OK, so let's look at an example spec. So there's some reading material that my helpers are going to hand out. Can you guys hand out some of the? Thank you. For those of you who have laptops, or if you want to try to check it out on your phones, there's a bit.ly link. And you can find the Google Doc there. There's 2 documents in there. So this is really kind of an example of the process I might go through. It's maybe a little more verbose than it would be for a project this size, but it helps to illustrate the process. So there's 2 docs in there. One are raw notes. This just is an example of what I might jot down as I'm thinking about this, discussing this with various stakeholders. You know, if I go back to the first document is my quick draft. I may jot down some of these notes. They're bullets, and then I'll sit down with various stakeholders and say, what do you guys think? And then there's actually the final spec that's in there. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to read through this. And then I have a few more slides that we can go through on some other tips. But I'd really like to open up the floor to questions at that point. So I'll let you guys read this for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll do pencils down. So I think most of you have gotten through the document at this point. In the interest of time, I wanted to move on and start having a conversation about what you guys have read and seen. So any thoughts, comments, questions? I've got a few canned questions up here that you guys can ask. The question was, in the rough draft, there are areas where there are open questions, and I've just said, hey, need to figure out X. Even though I'm writing this document, is that appropriate? And what do I do with those? And so, yeah, the answer is it's totally appropriate. The rough draft are literally just notes you're writing to yourself. And I use that to then say, who do I need to go talk to? Does this make any sense? I'm about to beat the Galaga high score. This may be a time to pop the question to my engineering team. Yes?
For the review session, do you do it ad hoc based on when you've written the spec, or do you go through and review a bunch of the different features and functionality together at one time?
For different projects, you mean?
Yeah.
I
mean, especially because there's like concurrent projects running, especially for small teams, and different things that might be working.
Sometimes I may review multiple projects, but I will only do that if all the people in the room, all those projects are relevant to that group, and we have enough time. But otherwise, usually I'll do a review before the doers in the group are actually going to start working on it, because that's when it's freshest. That's when we're going to iron out issues. And you know, as a product manager, you know you need to be a few weeks ahead of your dev team at all times. So I'll kind of be looking at our sprint log and saying, hey, next sprint, that's kind of when we want to start working on this. That sprint is a week and a half away. I need to get this shipped and ready. I also think that right now, my confidence level on this is pretty high. I think there are not going to be any surprises. So it's okay if I do it like, you know, the Wednesday or Thursday before the Monday when the sprint begins. On the other hand, if it's a more complex project and I'm like, oh man, I know, you know, Joe is going to really yell about what I'm going to do as ops team here, or, you know, Sally's going to push back on engineering for this reason. That tells me that I might need to do more than one review, or I might need to do it a little sooner. I see what you're saying. So the question is, in here I talk about, you know, can I model the financials such that, in Excel, such that I can validate, even if this works, is it worth scaling this out? For example, if there's no way a customer support person can resolve enough conversions, there's no, and the amount we pay them a day versus the conversion value, there's no point in doing this. And your question was, some products, specifically, I'm guessing analytical products, can be modeled in Excel as a prototype for a product feature that we're going to build. I think that's a great prototyping approach, and as PMs, use whatever's at your disposal to make it work. So drawing diagrams is one thing that you do, or wireframes of various sorts. If you are comfortable prototyping quickly in Excel, I think that's great. If you are comfortable writing a little bit of code and you're not going to waste a lot of time to demonstrate what you're doing, that can also be relevant. Of course, it matters what size of the project you're going to be working on. So yeah, if you're going to be building a whole new dashboard and you're like, to really get across what I'm talking about, I could spend hours doing wireframes, which, as you know, take a lot of time, but I think are really valuable things to do. Or you're like, I could spend the same amount of time, I think, mucking about in Excel and creating a prototype there. That's a great idea. Yes?
I think there's a book that talks about building prototypes using it. And the whole book covers different types of
Oh, that's awesome.
I'll try to locate it.
Yeah, that's great. For years, I've joked that the ultimate product would be a PowerPoint to code compiler. So you could just hand it off to the various teams in the business and say, here you go.
So for products where there's going to be a lot of product discovery work, so like prototyping, user testing, at what point are you making the spec? Is it prior to that or after that?
That is a great question. So what I haven't talked about here are so many of the other different functions that PMs. Oh, question was, for when do you write the spec? There's lots of other things we do, like use cases, discovery is a whole process of the product cycle. Are you writing specs for that? Are you writing it later? Does that represent the question? So yeah, I haven't, in here I'm talking about a very sort of tactical, you have a pretty good idea, you've gone through the discovery phase, you're pretty certain this is what the team wants to do. That's usually when I will get down to writing a spec. The discovery phase itself is a lot more amorphous, I'm working on a post where I talk about road mapping, and one of the things that I point out is discovery is a project. It should be scoped like a project. It requires work from the PM, it requires work from engineering, design. Everybody has to contribute in the discovery phase to some level, depending on the complexity of the project. So even if you are, some examples that I've seen in my career that pop up again and again. One of them is, at some point the company matures and says, should we create a mobile application, right? You have a website that's doing great, and then this discussion starts to happen, which is, should we create an iPhone app? Should we create an Android app? It's a significant investment. It will slow us down because now we're going to have to work on multiple channels. Parts of our website are not API driven, so we're going to have a refactoring process where we're going to have to clean that up. Oh man, this is like a big, big thing. So just making the decision on should we go mobile becomes a discovery process of many sorts. Not just is there value to the user and the business and how should the app work, but then what are all the engineering, various different pieces we have to do, and what operational overhead are we incurring for the rest of our product development cycle? Like every feature we make on the website now needs to be available here. So there are lots of those questions. I would look at that as a project, and I think it's appropriate to write a spec that says, hey, here are the big questions we're trying to answer. Here's how we're going to try to answer each of them. The deliverable of this project for the various parties involved is, I want my engineering lead to come back and tell me how much of a pain it's going to be to refactor these parts of our website that have to now have APIs that will power the application. My task is going to be to, did I mess that up? It's all good. Is to work with maybe me or the designer or some combination are going to work and say, what is the actual user experience going to be? So there's, maybe we're not even there yet. Maybe we need to actually sit down and talk with our users and make a decision on, is our site that looks great on a phone good enough? Or would you actually use our mobile app because maybe you'll get notifications for it? Or maybe that's a distribution channel where we've discovered a lot of people are going to the App Store and typing in SurveyMonkey. Now, this was something that happened at SurveyMonkey. My brother was VP of engineering at Harry's. They went through the same question on the mobile app. I've talked to countless friends in companies as they grow, and they all come to this question at some point. The ones that are recurring are, should we do mobile, and when should we do international? And when we do it, how how big a ball of wax is that? And should we do it? Should we not? Should we do it now? Should we not? Those are really large projects where I think it's appropriate to say, I'm going to spec this out like any project or product. There's others which are, hey, we think it would be nice to build a feature where people could bookmark their favorite hotels for later. Is this worth doing? Question mark. You know, and so why would we do it? Well, if you go back to your base goals, as you're road mapping and you're thinking about it, the reason you would come up with this idea is probably something to do with retention or maybe return engagement. Like we notice a lot of people come to our site, browse, and disappear. We have some evidence, a small percentage of them come back. We think we could improve their conversion rate if they could come back and go right back into what they were doing. So maybe bookmarking these and sharing them is relevant. For that, I would put that as a, I would take on myself, there's this idea and this. They're all sort of medium to small ideas that we think we need to do. We're not really sure. It's on me to go prove out that it's worth doing them. And that would be a roadmap item I would assign to myself. Since I'm mostly the person working on it, I don't think I would write a formal spec, but my notes would look a lot like what's up there. And I would assign myself a ticket in the sprint that says the deliverable is a clear decision on this with some reasoning. Expectations on what our conversion, like what are we going to measure if we build this thing to know that it worked? That's a deliverable. And then we could sit down and say, okay, let's pop it on the roadmap. Let's do it in one of our future sprints. Did that answer your question?
I think so, yeah. So you're saying this here is mostly for once something has already gone through that phase, but that you could also do specs prior to that to help you figure out like what questions you're trying to answer or what the things should be.
Yeah, and you know, in roles that I've worked at, I've actually been asked by non-engineering orgs to come and describe this process to their teams. So business and marketing teams, where the deliverables are a lot more amorphous, they're not actually producing a tangible product feature, but they might be running a marketing campaign, things like that, or working on a variety of biz dev deals. They find that going through a process like this is also valuable. On some level, this is project management as well. But I think what separates it is it's really driven on outcome, not just on making sure the pieces work in synchrony. Yes. Yep. So the question was, is it appropriate to as part of a spec, also talk about the validation of the idea? We're doing this because we've already learned X, Y, Z from surveys, from talking to customers. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of the context. So, you know, if you're looking at broad things, context to me is it's highly relevant to say, look, we've talked to a bunch of users. They've told us they really would use notifications if it was on their mobile app. We've looked at our competitors. They're offering this, and their marketing suggests that it's working. We've done focus groups, and you know, we believe that these things are true. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other question you were asking around, you know, getting people excited and about a specific idea, the communication part of this is getting people really aligned on being excited about doing this. And what I found, the strongest way that you get people excited is you really have to get people bought into the why. Why are we doing this? And if people are all aligned on, hey, look, if someone might look at this and go, you know how we could improve checkout conversion? It's 4 pages right now. Could we make it 1 frickin' page? Like, you know, that the goal, the why, is to improve checkout conversion. This is just one idea. And it may be that as you go through this process and talk to people, they'd be like, that's terrible. And or maybe a counter to that is, you're absolutely right, but we've done a quick scoping on this, and turning it from 4 to 1 page is going to be it's going to be at least a 6 to 8 week project, and we need a win that's faster than that. In either case, we are probably going to do that in the next quarter, but we'd still slap on live chat if that could help. I don't know. So I think the why is a big part, and then any validation you can provide helps. Yes? So the question was, is this document a source of truth? Once it's out there, how do you make sure the project is on track? People are doing what's necessary. Yeah, I use the document as a source of truth until the conclusion of the project. I don't mind if these documents go stale afterwards. It's not supposed to represent what's in the product. It's really, the goal of the document to me is to successfully execute a project with minimal pain. So, when I was a junior engineer, I used to walk around being like, oh man, meetings and documentation, and like, wow. And over time, I realized like, the bigger things you do and the more people that work on something, it's kind of like physics. There's just going to be more friction. There's going to be more lost energy and heat. So instead of complaining and kvetching about it and being like, why are humans so inefficient? You could instead work on approaches to address that. And so that's where I think, that's kind of how I think about it. That's the actual goal of the doc. So during the project, I would typically keep a web page. So you could go for our team at any time and see, here is our roadmap this quarter. We did quarterly planning, which I think works reasonably well. And this was, we started doing this when SurveyMonkey was about 50 people big and continued to do it up to 700 people. I'm still done there. So we do quarterly planning. As part of that, I'd publish a roadmap on here are the major things that we plan to accomplish this quarter. For each of the projects there, you could click through and land on either a page that says, either there'd be a thing that said, not spec'd yet, there's a ticket for this, go see it, and bug Gaurav or whoever else is doing that. Or you'd click through and you'd see the spec. And there'd be some status on that roadmap page that says this project is done, it's in progress, it's behind, it's at the coding stage or building stage, whatever. So I would keep that document up to date. And I would even actually hand off ownership to the various parties. I'm like, hey, engineering team, you guys are going to know, thank you, 10 minutes. You guys are going to know more about what's going on in this project down the road. I want you to keep updating the spec. I'll be a watcher on this page, so when edits come through, I will be reviewing them. Related to that will be the tickets. So for a project, there'll be a spec, and then we may break it down into half a dozen tickets, depending on the complexity, that may happen over 1, 2, or 3 sprints. I usually wouldn't write, if it's something that's going to take more than 3 sprints, it needs to be broken down even further. 3 sprints is about the maximum size for which I would say it's worth writing a spec. I'd be like, otherwise we're probably doing it wrong. But throughout that, I would keep it up to date so anybody on the team can go and see what's going on. And I would also point to the various sprints and tickets saying, if you want to know very specific status and who's doing what right now, go and look at this and you can talk to them. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Yes?
I guess I have more of an observation in the request.
That's very nice. Thank you. I would like to offer that class. The question was, the observation is, while we're discussing an artifact, the document, what is under the surface is that this is about making people move, orchestrating people to move together, and you need social clout and the ability to move organizations to do this. That's the thing. You guys hear the abstractions of product managers. What are they? They're the CEOs of a product, and they're the glue of an organization, and they don't have any authority, but they need to earn it, and with respect. Like, you guys have all seen, you guys have all heard these generalizations. You're like, how do I actually put this into practice? It's hard. You'll put it into practice. What helped me was I used to be an engineer, and I used to be on the other end of poorly conceived or thought out ideas that had strict deadlines where things changed or we discovered something was wrong. And so what I found is the PMs that I worked with who I gave the most trust to and started to listen to were the ones who respected my time and what I did. And they did that by coming to me with things where, one, they were coming to me with sort of specifics on what needed to be done. And they showed me that they had done their homework. They hadn't just been like, dude, let's add live chat, it'll reduce, and I've talked to customer ops already, like, rock on. Like, it was, hey, I've thought through, like, hey, customer ops will need to tag conversations. We need to have that. Like, conversion needs to go up by this much. I've confirmed with BI that this logging will actually work. And over time, that trust allowed them to say, okay, that's valuable. The other part of it was, I didn't preach to them on how it needed to be done or when I expected them to deliver. I would say, look, if the project's going to take longer than this, we probably don't want to execute it or we need to scope it down. But you're the one who owns that. You need to tell me that. and you're gonna work on how it gets done. So I think starting by gaining the trust of your engineering team is very strong, is a big thing. And then the other is to gain trust from the rest of the organization that this is a valid approach, is you need to show that this process results in consistent delivery. And a big part of that is also learning to say no, because the pressure will always be on to deliver at a tight timeline or deliver more than was there. If you're able to go and respectfully tell people, I don't think it's appropriate for us to put into scope to have this work on all languages out the gate for a test. I don't think it's appropriate that we pick the perfect vendor that can be rolled out not across checkout, but these 6 other places that customer ops has said they want live chat to be added to help. Here's why, here's my reasoning. And then you follow up and you deliver. That begins to earn the trust of the org. I know these are really sort of soft things, but I believe that a lot of it is trust-oriented. When people begin to recognize, like, hey, this guy, this gal, when they tell me this is how it's going to work, I know that they've done the work. They're not just throwing it off over the fence. That really helps. There's another part of what you said. Part of this is organizing people. But the other part, I have to say, is critical thinking. There are lots of, as you read the nuances in this document, there are lots of little things in there. And if you just spent an afternoon and sat down in, maybe not your giant open workspace, but went for a walk or found a quieter spot with or headphones, you may realize, oh yeah, I do need to point out, like, let's just make sure that when we assign someone to this group, when they come back next time, they still see live chat. Let's make sure that, I don't know, there's a variety of little examples in there. But I think critical thinking, if you take away anything from this, as a PM, it's important to, you are an individual contributor. Maybe you're not writing lines of code or you're not designing something, but you are ultimately making a variety of decisions. That's not because you're a despot and you're like the ruler of the org. It's because your job is to take what the business needs, what is actually achievable, all of the great ideas that are coming from your engineering, design, various other teams, marketing teams, and synthesize and say, amongst all these choices, it's important, here's the path that I think, based on my homework and reasoning, we should take. And I present this to my team, walk them through it, and get their respect. If you don't do that, if you're like, oh man, I need to make this person happy and that person happy, you end up with design by committee. And we know that that leads to really poor products and often poor process and headaches. I think we only have a couple of minutes left. I'll take 1 or 2 more questions back there. Critical thinking, the question was, critical thinking is an important part of this, but sometimes you get last minute requests just before a sprint. What techniques and arguments have I used to push back on that? The biggest argument is around ROI. So why am I getting this request? What do we think we'll get out of this? It's important for me to say, oh man, that's actually highly relevant. I'm trying to think of an example. You might at the last minute say, somebody might be like, hey, we've been working on this other project. It's actually doing pretty well. We really need you to add to your part of the website some buttons and a flow to drive into this product feature. We wouldn't have asked. We didn't think it would do this well. It's really important that you stick it in. And then I'm like, man, that page that we render looks really different for like 6 different types of user. It's just sticking this in there. There's already a mess of if-then-else logic. It's actually not trivial in the QA cycle. It looks like we're just adding a blurb, but it's actually pretty hard. So with that context, I'll turn back to them and be like, hey, look, here's the thing. This is why it's hard. So you got to explain, bring them on, explain to them where you're coming from. This is why it's hard, and it does take QA time. If we rush this out, and the fact that it has to work in multiple languages, we will probably have a bunch of errors. And I will need your team and my team to support them. If the ROI is really there, let's get these people together and explain why we're doing it, and say, look, it's going to be a shitty couple of weeks, but the value is so clear. Think about the number of new conversions we're going to get. We're all going to look like heroes. Do you all agree that it's worth doing this? Other times I'll be like, dude, if I waited 2 weeks, what would happen? I'm sorry that you promised this, and that's unreasonable. And if it means that you have to escalate this up, let's go and chat, because let's go and chat with whoever it is that you owe this to. because the truth is, what you're asking for is not practical. It's going to throw a gear into a variety of other projects that we're doing. And how am I going to convince all of the people working on this project that we're respecting their time and doing something reasonable? It's just going to look to them like I'm saving my own ass because I didn't think about it or because I can't say no. So, but again, it takes time to get to that position in an organization. When you're starting off as a junior PM or developer, you really do want to please and you want to say yes. So I think you have to be very thoughtful and firm when you have these discussions, and you'll find that people who are making these unreasonable requests often will agree. So we're out of time. I'll be around all day and at the event afterwards. I'm also exploring an idea in the industrial Internet of Things space. So if anyone works in that space, for those who heard the previous talk, I know why people wanted to use Fitbits to track cows, because that is a use case that I've seen. So I can explain that too. But thank you.